welcome to What a Scream, the podcast where I, your host, Grain, chat about horror movies with a special guest every week. And in particular, we discuss and dissect movies that have to do with a certain subject or theme that I have previously randomly chosen. So this is episode 34, 5, either one of those. I am not keeping count whatsoever. I really should be. But yeah, thank you so much for listening so far, and for going on this weird adventure with me where I talk to people from all over the globe, from all walks of life, about my favorite subject ever, which is horror movies. So this week, my special guest is Aoife, and together we are discussing feminist horror. That is horror films with certain feminist ideologies, and what we personally feel is quite in line with a feminist ethos. Now, there is a slight dilemma when we're talking about feminist films because, like horror films and like art in general, it's very subjective. So what one person may find empowering, another may find demeaning, especially when we look at films such as I Spit on Your Grave or any of those kind of rape revenge kind of films. A lot of films that we say, oh yes, they're feminist from one point of view, might only be feminist to like white cis women, as opposed to any other gender, any other race, any other sexuality. So it's really important that even though we're discussing these films on the topic of feminism, we can also be kind of objective and realize that while yes, they do have some points of view that are very feminist, sometimes they can be very problematic as well, and that's really important to keep in mind when you're discussing art such as horror films. So this week, myself and Aoife are going to be chatting about 1996 Wes Craven directed Scream, and also Jennifer's Body from 2009, directed by Karyn Kusama and written by Diablo Cody. So yeah, I hope you enjoy our chat, and as ever, don't forget that you can also get involved in the discussion by heading over to our social media, which I will give the links to at the end of the episode. So enjoy. So I would like to welcome to the podcast Aoife. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You're very, very welcome. How have you been? What have you been up to? Watching lots of horror recently?
I wish. I have actually been very busy with work. It's summer's always busy for me. And then I have that lull before the kind of Christmas crafty section of the year. But no, I've been good. It's busy in a good way, but surprisingly busy.
That's good. So would you like to give a short introduction about yourself and what you do?
Yeah, I am Aoife. Hi. I work primarily as an art director in film. A little bit of design, a little bit of set dressing, but mostly as an art director, kind of smaller scale stuff, commercials, short films. I also run an online crafting shop called The Art Shop and do a little bit of a spooky related crafting myself when I have the time. I also have a master's in film studies, which I finished last year. So I'm trying to get back into like reviews and writing and hopefully one day a podcast of my own, but we'll see.
You will. And what got you into like film direction and art direction?
Well, when I was in school, I wanted to do set design for theatre because we did a musical part of TY, and I was like, I found my calling. I'm not a stage person at all. I don't like being on the stage or in front of the camera, but I loved building sets and anything to do with props or anything like that. So that's kind of the direction I wanted to go in. There wasn't really a course for it at the time, so I ended up going a fine art route. So I actually did sculpture. And then from there, I went to IDT, which is part of the National Film School, or the National Film School is part of IDT. And I kind of got into film that way. And I realized I much preferred the structure of film than I did theater.
Yeah.
So yeah, I've kind of have dabbled in both, but I just love film, everything film. And like the more I've gone on and worked in it, and especially doing the master's, I realized that film has always been a part of my life and has always been a big part of who I am as a person and what I relate to in kind of every aspect.
That's great. And are you a fan of horror?
I am. It's weird. I was thinking about this question because like when I was younger, I wouldn't have said I was a fan of horror. I'd even like as a teenager and in college, that it was kind of at the height of the kind of gore porn era, which I wasn't into at all. I'm still not. But I have a very niche enjoyment of horror, but I definitely have an enjoyment of it.
And what is that niche enjoyment?
Well, again, off the top of my head, I would think that like Buffy the Vampire Slayer started me on my path. But as I think about my childhood, I was raised on the spooky 80s and early 90s of Hocus Pocus and Casper. And I was a huge fan of weird 80s fantasy films when I was very young, too young to be watching them, but still love them all. So I think that very much influenced my enjoyment of film in general. And then when I discovered Buffy when I was about 11 or 12, it kind of brought me back into that world, I think. So that's the kind of trajectory I've taken over the last few years in my enjoyment. I love vampire films. I love anything kind of to do with the gothic. I've realized that I love that sort of like spooky kind of ghost story vampires, old school kind of horror, less so than the like. I also love like the slasher films as well, which I got into later. Like as we'll talk about, like the kind of Scream era was kind of what brought me into it as well. So it's a very niche enjoyment in very select areas of horror, but those areas I really do enjoy.
And do you remember the very first horror film you ever saw?
Proper horror was probably Scream.
Okay.
Though, yeah, I think it was probably Scream. So again, I think like I've always had that spooky influence, but I don't think you can really classify Hocus Pocus as a horror. But I do love like the Burton era of, let's say, Sleepy Hollow and his kind of like darker edge of things. So they were kind of the first, and then the Scream era kind of brought me into the slashers, which they're enjoyable. But yeah, I think that was probably the first. I do remember seeing Beetlejuice when I was very young. Again, I was always a fan of the kind of Tim Burton aesthetic. And the majority of that film I was fine with. And then the last scene where they call them back, they call the ghost back and they kind of appear above, freaked me out so much. Like traumatized me. And I was just like, I don't know if I like this anymore.
I recorded an episode there with Ruby Noir a couple of weeks ago, and we chatted about children's horror. So that would have been like the Tim Burton, the Hocus Pocus, that kind of, and how it's kind of a gateway. And I had a similar reaction as you did with Beetlejuice, and I had it with Edward Scissorhands, that I was fine with it, apart from the bit where he sticks his finger into a waterbed, and for some reason that just got me. Like I was behind that sofa hiding, like I was petrified of that scene for some reason. But yeah, I always think like that kind of Hocus Pocus Tim Burton is horror, because you know, it's the uncanny, it's the weird, it's basically what you start off liking as a child.
And I think definitely our generation as well, we were kind of raised on that sort of darker, slightly darker entertainment media, I suppose. Again, I have no idea what kids watch these days, but I have a feeling that it doesn't have that kind of uncanny, a supernatural edge to it. It's a little bit more reality driven or whatever. But yeah, I think our generation especially has that big influence. So I think it really pushes towards this sort of horror aesthetic, if nothing else.
And this kind of leads on to our theme for the episode. But so with me, I have this real nostalgia thing for like Tim Burton. And, you know, I really loved Tim Burton films from like back in the day, not so much his recent stuff, but I have a real moral thing about Tim Burton and how he sticks to a certain type of person. And, you know, he's been quite vocal in saying that he doesn't believe that Black people feed into his aesthetic. How do you kind of balance that kind of nostalgic love for something that he's done versus the fact that it's not a very inclusive kind of, he's not an inclusive director, basically?
Yeah, very much so. And you kind of just going on the back of that, I felt with his Alice in Wonderland films in the recent years, I think that was the last moment where I was kind of hopeful that he was going to bring in a little bit more diversity and kind of make more likable lead female, I suppose. And it just didn't happen. And I was just like, okay, I'm done. I was like, I will still watch Sleepy Hollow every single Halloween, but that's about it. And The Corpse Bride. It's one of my favorite. I don't know. It's the same sort of question in relation to most recently, I suppose, with like the Harry Potter world, when an author or an author isn't likable for their behaviors or for the decisions they make or whatever. But I feel you can sometimes separate that from the work they produce. I don't know. I think it comes down to community as well. Like, let's say for the Harry Potter community, it's the Harry Potter community have accepted this world as their own and made the community inclusive, even if the creator of the world is not so inclusive. So possibly the same with Tim Burton, but then when you rewatch old stuff and you realize how, as an older, more educated person who has grown both as a woman or as a queer person or a like non-fluid gender person, whichever category you might fit into, it's difficult to watch those things when you don't see yourself on the screen, and especially for anybody, obviously I can't relate, but anybody of color or from more kind of ethnic background. Is that the right word? Am I allowed to use that word? Yeah, it's kind of difficult to watch. So it's a tough question. It really is a tough question. Again, I try to enjoy the aesthetic more than the content, if that's allowed.
I get you. Yeah. So I guess that kind of brings us on to our topic for this week, which is feminist horror. Let me start off by asking, do you think the horror tradition, so we're talking about like horror from, let's say early 2000s backwards, do you think it is feminist?
In a very short answer, no. But in a more in-depth discussion answer, maybe. I think on the surface, it could work both ways. I think it came in with your discussion of the Final Girl and 80s slasher movies as well, which will all come into our discussion today as well. I think on the surface, it could be taken one way or another. Like with the Final Girl, on the surface, you can be like, okay, yes, she's the surviving woman. She is a strong, independent person. There could be on the surface, you could see that as a feminist icon, but when you actually look into how they're coded and what they mean in terms of a character trope, it's not so much. And then you could go the opposite way. You could look at films that have, let's say, the kind of female vampire or like the kind of monstrous feminine. On the surface, it's not. But then maybe if you look into a little bit more, they may be representing a more feminist ideal within the horror genre. So I think it comes down to obviously context and also who's making the films. I think, again, with the whole philosophical idea of death of the author, like a filmmaker may want to portray something, but it's always going to be how the audience reads it. I think it all comes down to. So I think, again, another tough question.
I think, like you said, it's all about like intention versus perception. So like you said, a filmmaker could make a film and it could kind of start out to be, I want to make, this strong feminist kind of message, but it might not be perceived that way. Like you said, we've got it on both ways where it's like, it might not have, we'll take the example of, say, like, I Spit on Your Grave. I'm sure like the filmmaker, I think, is it a Wes Craven film? It is.
Very early Wes Craven, I think.
He probably didn't start out being like, right, I want this to be a feminist speak piece and I want, women to really blah, blah, blah. He's probably just be like, you know what? I'm just going to make this like fucking rape revenge movie, whatever, interesting viewpoint. But I know so many people who are women who really identify with it as a piece of feminist filmmaking, and it's kind of strange how that one, but it's very divisive at the same time.
I think a lot, even not just talking about the horror genre, but like everything, I suppose. Let's say I'm very big into like the Marvel films, and let's say with the new Black Widow film that comes out, like on one hand you have, yay, you know, a solo female superhero, you know, gets her own stage, I suppose. But then on the other hand, it wasn't an orange story. It was like a more of an ensemble film.
Yeah.
You have like kind of how would you put it, a mixed reception of Scarlett Johansson in general, you know. So you like, I think anything, some people may take it as they flagged, they wave for their feminist icon, or that was total bullcrap and was a disgrace to femininity, or not like feminism, you know. So yeah, I think it is very much about, as you say, intention about against interpretation. So,
yeah, absolutely. So what do you think in terms of horror movies makes...
Sorry, I was looking up, I spit on your grave. The original. Never mind. I am an IMDb fanatic.
Yeah.
I have a problem.
So in terms of horror film and the horror genre, what do you think makes a good feminist piece of horror movie?
Again, I was trying to like pinpoint while like we were watching the films and doing a little bit of research. And I think we'll get into it more when we discuss the films, but I think it's about, for me anyway, it's about breaking those tropes, like breaking those boundaries that have been set up in the past, like the final girl, like the monstrous feminine, like these sort of iconic figures that in one way could be feminist, but in a lot of ways are not. So it's kind of breaking those boundaries completely, maybe not even completely, but like changing them to adapt to a more, I suppose, feminist gaze is how you could describe it. I think that for me, that's what it is, because that's what I've always found the most difficult about being like, both as a young girl and as a woman. It's about the boxes they try and put you into. I've always found it very frustrating. Like, I'm a cis woman. I've never had any sort of like identity issues, but it was more about how I was perceived and treated as a girl that used to always get on my nerves, and like from a very young age. So I think not just in horror, for everybody, or for like any sort of media outlet, it's breaking the boundaries that they have pushed women into for a very, 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 very long time.
Yeah, absolutely.
For me anyway.
Yeah. So let's get on with our first film. Okay. If you want to introduce it and give us a brief synopsis.
Okay. Kind of a, maybe not the most obvious choice. But the film I chose for discussion today is Scream. 1996 slasher, kind of post slasher, I suppose, directed by Wes Craven, and it centers around a series of murders in a small town of Woodsboro, and they kind of end up centering around this one character, Sidney Prescott, and the film takes place a year after her mother was also murdered in the same small town, I suppose. So yeah, kind of in a traditional slasher movie sense, it's centered around a group of teenagers, and the killer kind of, again, traditionally wise, it stalks them and kind of psychologically torments them before killing them as well. So that's kind of a brief rundown of what Scream is, if you haven't seen it. Yeah, like if anybody who hasn't seen it.
Although, funnily enough, me and my husband were chatting today about Scream, and he was like, I think Scream was like one of the first horror films that I ever saw. And I actually, because I was never a big fan of the slasher, I didn't see it until quite later on, and I saw it only after I'd seen Scary Movie.
Oh no.
Yeah.
Oh no.
Yeah, so I watched Scary Movie first and then went back and watched Scream.
Oh, it's even more ridiculous then.
Right? Then you're like, oh fuck. But are you a fan of Scream?
I am. I really am. But again, in that sort of like slight parody play on the traditional slasher. So like we were saying earlier, it was one of the first proper horror films I saw, and it was kind of the one moment, because again, I was always like, no, I don't like scary movies. But when I saw Scream, and again, I was only about maybe 11 or 12 at the time.
Yeah.
And I was kind of like, oh, I was like, this is fun, but in a really kind of violent way. But there's something wrong with me. I really enjoyed this. But yeah, I do like Scream. I haven't seen any of the kind of newer, not even I think the new one isn't a remake. I think it's like a relaunch or something. And I haven't seen like the TV series of that.
Okay.
It's kind of just the original trilogy that I've seen. I've been meaning to watch the TV series. I've heard it's good, but I don't know.
Yeah, same. I actually did a full-on, I watched all 4 Scream movies this week.
Oh, did you?
I did, yeah, because I'd always...
I wish I had.
I'd only seen the first one. I was like, you know what? I just need to get it all out my system. Like you, I haven't seen the TV show either. I'm not wildly bothered about it. But I really enjoy Scream, even though I'm not into slashers. I really enjoy it because, like you said, it's so much fun. Because, yes, it's really gory. The kills are horrible. Yeah. But it's funny and it's meta. And it's like Wes Craven just wanted to have a bit of fun.
Yeah.
And
definitely.
That's what I love. And it looks like all the actors are having fun as well. And it just looks like this big, fun slasher party.
Yeah, it's great. Like, and I think because I was introduced to Scream first and then like went back and kind of watched some of the older ones. And the only one that I kind of enjoy as much as Scream is Nightmare on Elm Street, which is another Wes Craven. And it's like the late 80s kind of coming into the like postmodern slasher, which then Scream takes to an even higher level of weirdness. Not weirdness, but yeah, no, I do enjoy it. And that's kind of level of horror that I enjoy as well. Kind of like ridiculous gore, you know, kind of playful, exciting. It's probably why I love like kind of Criminal Minds and stuff like that. I love as well.
Criminal Minds, me too. I kind of feel like Wes Craven is like the Stan Lee of horror. Like whenever he does a film, he always has to make a cameo in it, right? Yeah. So I just feel like Wes Craven was like the Stan Lee equivalent. So getting back to our topic, why did you pick Scream as a piece of feminist filmmaking?
I think, well, both because it stands with me as like a fan of horror, and again, it kind of was in line with Buffy the Vampire Slayer in terms of how it influenced me and how it influenced kind of my enjoyment of everything. nothing will compare to Buffy. But also when we take into the, like, as we were saying earlier, the trope of the final girl, I feel Scream, now we started to do it in Nightmare on Elm Street, but I feel Scream broke the trope. It finally kind of broke out, and even though it sticks to a very similar format as the 80s slasher and the final girl as well, it kind of, as I was saying, breaks those boundaries of what makes the final girl less feminist, as we would hope. I suppose
I mean, let's have a look at Sydney as the final girl. You know, there, like you said, it does follow some sort of formula. She's got, you know, like a gender fluid name, just like Laurie or, you know, Ripley or something. But that's where it kind of ends when it gets to, apart from like, you know, she has a connection to the killer. There's, you know, an anniversary of a date that's happened. But that's kind of where the similarities end. Yeah.
I feel like, again, with the tropes you were saying, like a connection to the killer, but also an anniversary that comes around. Generally, it's the anniversary of the killer, as in like an anniversary associated with the killer. And I know in Scream they try and like make it seem like, well, it does end up to be the same person. But it's more like it's her anniversary. I feel like she represents a lot of the tropes with this slasher killer as well as like the final girl. There's also like little things like on the rewatch I noticed, like she's the only one, like they all kind of fight back. But she's the only one that actually makes physical contact with her attacker. You know, she, like, in the very first interaction with him, she kicks him in the stomach and she like punches him in the face and everything, you know. So and the obvious one, she has sex in the film. And even like, you know, Randy's character kind of brings in the, I suppose, the standard, you know, he kind of is there to make us aware of the standard of the slash film or the horror film. So he's kind of like, these are the rules and this is what you have to do. And even it said, now that she's had sex, you have to die, but she doesn't. And I know it's a very obvious one, but it's one of the aspects of the traditional final girl that makes it less feminine or less feminist.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one thing that I really kind of liked was in the beginning, you know, she has this boyfriend that is kind of pressuring her into, and she's like, no, it will be on my terms when I want to, you know, here, have a sneak preview. That's as far as I want to go. And she's
again, it was her choice to like display herself in any sort of way. It wasn't like he went over the line or that. So yeah, it was great.
And then even when she did have sex, it wasn't like what we'd expect would be like instant regret and like, oh my God, what have I done? I've given myself away. And you know, all this kind of crap that comes with this theory of females losing their virginity. And it doesn't have that. She's very much like, okay, that was that. Cool. Yeah. Great. Awesome.
That was done. That was all right, I suppose.
That was it. No bells and whistles. It was grand. Whatever. And I really like that because that's what losing your virginity is like. You know, it isn't this great big massive thing. It's, you know, something that should be done on your terms. And it's just happens. It's just a thing. Yeah. Another thing I really loved about Sydney was especially carrying on from the 80s slasher episode that I did, and any interaction that any of the kind of the victims had with the killer, it was really silly, and it was kind of like, oh no, don't hurt me, like they'd throw like a phone at him or something, you know, like that. Like Sydney fights. Yeah. Like she is fucking so smart, and she's like throwing punches, and she's using all her like street smarts to get away. And there's a bit in the bathroom where she slides under the sinks.
Yes.
And I'm just like, that's so fucking smart, because of course you would look for any way out.
Yeah. And even like from the like at the like still kind of end of Act 1 where she gets the first phone call. And like straight away she's like, I'm not taking your shit. She's like, well, I called your bluff. You're not on my patio, you know, or on my porch, you know. So like compared to like the opening scene with Drew Barrymore, who is so good. But like compared to like, let's say their interaction on the phone where like Drew Barrymore's character like very quickly gets very scared and very like starts crying and stuff. Sydney never gets to that point, even by the like third act where she's like confronted with everybody dying around her. She doesn't lose that edge, you know, like they never break her. And I love like towards the end where like the guys, like they've been exposed or whatever, and spoilers, the guys have been exposed and they kind of get distracted by Gail, who is somebody else we need to talk about. And she gets away with her dad into another part of the house, and then she calls him. Like I just found like that was such, again, kind of breaking the trope and kind of turning it around on itself, that like not only does she defeat them, but she nearly gets her own back, you know. She kind of does the same sort of psychological attack, I suppose, as they were doing to her, which I thought was just great.
So let's talk about Gail, the other kind of strong female character in Scream. So what is your opinion on Gail, who's played by Courtney Cox, and it's great. I really enjoyed her character.
I think when I was younger, and again I suppose when you're younger and you're still kind of within the whole bubble of, I don't know, homogeny or hegemon. I always get that word wrong. No, hegemon. I always get that word wrong. Give me a sec. It's like the structure of society that we all live by, like heteronormative society. I suppose, like, you know, when you're younger and you're still in that bubble and you don't really think past it, Gail's the type of person that you think is just a bitch and is really kind of not annoying, but you're kind of like, oh, you're not very likable because you're a bitch. But now that you're older and you rewatch these films, you're like, she's a badass.
I mean, it's like, it's internalized misogyny that you're brought up around because of the patriarchy, and you are meant to think that anyone who is a ballbuster, anyone who fucking goes out there, doesn't give a shit, and like knows what they want and knows how to get it, we're inclined to think, oh, they're a bitch and they're annoying and they'd step over anybody and blah blah blah. Exactly. And it's like, fuck yeah. Like yeah.
She's definitely more, as you get older, she's the more empowering character. I think she's great. And like, I wrote an essay during my master's about the influence of Sydney and Gail on Stranger Things, and how they're both could be interpreted as the final girl, and how those influences came into like Stranger Things with Nancy and Joyce. There we go. So yeah, like Gail herself could be seen as a final girl, because again, especially when you see the sequels, she's also one of the like lone survivors of this kind of, and she has personal connections. She has like a direct interactions. She's kind of involved with the whole adversary of them between Sydney's mom's murder and then later on with the Woodsbury killings. And you know, I think she's an even more empowering final girl figure, I think. Not than Sydney, but as well as Sydney.
Yeah, they've definitely got two kind of the two levels of kind of like the final girl. You know, we have Sydney, who's quite, even though she's very, very strong, she's also very nurturing. She's very, you know, she's very quite placid. You know, she's quite relaxed, and especially kind of in the sequels, we see her kind of taking on a caring role because she does get a job as a women's hotline speaker. That makes it sound like something else. No, yeah. So for like domestic abuse.
Yeah, helpline.
Helpline, that's operator. The word. Not a hotline. That's something else. That's another job.
Which is also okay.
That is also very valid. Sex work is work. But yeah, and then we've got Gail, who is the other side of it, who is like very headstrong, very stubborn, very, you know, will go fucking guns blazing and doesn't stop to get what she wants. Even if it puts her in danger, she just wants to get the truth. And that's really admirable as well. So what do you think about the men in Scream?
Yeah, I was just looking through my notes there and I was like, haha. Well, the first note I actually have with the men is that one, the first person that's killed on screen is a man, is Steve, is Cass's boyfriend. And then there is, I think, like 3 times the amount of men are actually killed instead of women. So there's actually only 2 women that are killed on screen anyway. And I think there's like 6 guys who are killed by the end of it, maybe 7. So I think that was the most prominent thing that stood out to me, like as a slasher film. And again, the main victim is Sydney. She's a woman. It's centered around that. And again, killer ends up being crazy ass boyfriend, you know. But when it comes down to kind of the, I suppose, again, structure like of the traditional slasher film, very few women actually become victims in this film. So I think that was the first thing that came to me. There was more male victims than there was female victims. And then you have Dewey. You have the character of Dewey, who is a sheriff deputy, played by David Arquette, as, again, if anybody hasn't seen it, who is just ridiculous. It's just like, I think he's more like, he's very aptly represented in the Scary Movie films. Like, it's like, again, I remember again seeing Scream when I was quite young, and then Scary Movie came out, and like my younger sisters were big into Scary Movie, and I remember after seeing Scary Movie watching Scream again, I was like, oh my god, he is that ridiculously dumb. So I think the kind of the main male authoritative figure in Dewey and in the principal, they're both completely inept at their jobs, and they're incompetent in terms of protecting any of the like both female characters and any of the kind of teenage characters. So I think that was, again, a break from the traditional role, especially in something like Halloween, where the final girl is rescued. Like, he was there supposed to be protecting Sydney, and Sydney and Gail end up killing the 2 killers and saving him as well because he was knocked out. You know, so it's just that sort of, these male characters that should be the heroes and just are not.
And then the thing that stuck out to me was the character of Billy, who is her boyfriend initially,
Yes.
and then we find out that himself and his friend, and I've forgotten his friend's name, played by Scooby-Doo guy.
Yeah, I was like, Shaggy
I
from
can't
Scooby-Doo.
even remember his name. Matthew
It's
Lillard.
like
There we go. Stuart. There we
Stu.
go.
There we go.
Stu.
Sorry, that took way too long.
So Billy and Stu, it turns out they are the killers. And the thing I love about it is, so Billy does this because Sydney's mom was having an affair with his dad, and that's why his mom left. And I just love the way that allegedly, but I just love the way that, I can't remember whether it's Gail or Sydney, turn around and they're like, "You've just got mummy issues."
Yeah.
And I loved that because, like, we see that so much in the slasher tropes, but it's never explicitly said. And whereas here, they're just like, "You're a toxic man with fucking mummy issues." And we see all this thing about, oh, girls with daddy issues and blah, 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 blah. And it was so good to hear that turned on its head.
Yeah, definitely. And again, that was in the phone call where she calls back to him. And it was, I marked that as well. It's just like such mommy issues. And it's so true, because even with, let's say, traditional, I keep saying that word, stereotypical, I suppose, characters such as like Norman Bates in Psycho, like they're all stems down, not all of them, but a lot of them stem to like having like mommy issues. But yeah, as you say, it's never called out. It's always not justified, but it's just like, oh, this is how they are, you know. They have, it's kind of come down to that sort of inherent evil in somebody. But Billy's not inherently evil. He's just an ass. A spoiled ass.
But that is so much like actual real life, like toxic men, even like killers. It just comes down to, they're just assholes. And so much of the time it's blamed on the mother. You know, it's all inherently the mother's fault. And we see that so much in like films, like you said, like Psycho, like even in Friday the 13th to an extent. It's always the monstrous mother figure. But in Scream, it's like, okay, he's got mummy issues, but as you said, it's just because he's a spoiled little boy who like is just an asshole.
Like his mom might have left his dad, but that didn't leave him abandoned. Like he has, you know, like a stable household. Like he's got obviously a good income because his dad can come in and like bail him out of jail. He's got like a supportive girlfriend, possibly too supportive at times. You know, like he's not abandoned and left for dead or has to become a surrogate for somebody else. Like he's fine. He's absolutely fine.
And he's such a gaslighting little arsehole. Like there's a point where she's like, you know, it's the anniversary of her mother's death. She's like feeling pretty shit about it. And he's like, oh, you've got to just get over it. I mean, my mom left. And it's like, oh my God. And the sad thing is, I know people like that. Like I've come across partners like that who are like, oh my God, you've gone through this really traumatic thing. Just get over it. Like, you know, I hurt my back today. Isn't that boohoo? And you're just like, go to fucking hell, mate.
Not
go to hell. Like, And I just love that that's called out again.
Yeah.
Like, as I think gaslighting should be, it should be fucking called out. Like,
and even when they do end up having sex, it is on her terms. It's not like it was another sort of session where he's starting to pressure and she went to him and was like, I have decided I want to do this. You know, that sort of way. It reminded me of the opening scene when he comes into our bedroom. What is the film he was watching? Was it The Exorcist?
Yes, it was.
Yeah. And he was like, oh, I was watching The Exorcist and it made me think of you. And you're like, what? And then he like twists it around to make it like sympathy on him. And he's like, oh, I miss my girlfriend. It's like, no, you are just crazy.
Somehow The Exorcist made you horny. Like, let's not sugarcoat
red flag.
It. Red flag number one. So what do you think? I mean, if we look at Scream as a feminist horror, we've pointed out ways in which in what ways is it not?
Well, I think aside from, I suppose, Gail and Sydney's like final stand, a lot of the build up to, I suppose, Sydney's empowerment by beating the killer. There is a lot there that is very anti-feminist, like her friend. I can't even remember her character's name. Something. Can't remember. Anyway, her friend who gets killed in the carriage door. Her character especially was very much in line with the kind of older female tropes. Now, I think, again, like reading and kind of looking at it from a more like postmodern point of view, I think it's a play on those stereotypical characters, but at the same time, she's still there.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. Like, she's still portrayed as kind of a little bit slutty, and she's the only, like, she wears a skirt, and she's obviously has a long-term sexually active boyfriend. You know, it's those kind of tropes that are still in play.
Yeah.
And that might be a little bit less so. There was another point in there, I can't remember it.
For me, it's obviously it's a victim of its time, and it doesn't have any, you know, two-dimensional, and it's kind of weird because I know they take note of this, but they don't have any two-dimensional Black or Indigenous or people of color. I mean, they do at the beginning of the second one, and the whole opening is about that. You know, there's like Jada Pinkett Smith is there, I think, with I think he's called Omar Epps, and they're like, oh, the Black people always get. I think he's from House. Yeah. And they're like, you know, the Black people always die first in these things, so like, why do you like them? And it's very meta in that way. And then they have like one Black character in, is it the fourth or the third one? The third one, sorry. They have one Black character, and he even makes a comment about how he is the token. So it's very meta in that way. But then it's not at all, because we still have like the Black best friend in the second one, who is only there to like help Sydney or protect Sydney or, you know, be her sidekick. And then even in the fourth one, which is meta to an extent, but not to the same extent that the other three were, they still don't have any other characters apart from white people.
Yeah, it's like them commenting on these tropes, yet not totally breaking them. Again, like they kind of broke the final girl trope in like Sydney and Gail, but they didn't make an effort to change her story in any way. And it's the same with like characters that are like LGBT plus representation. Like, it may have been comment on that these are the issues within like the slasher genre, but they don't make an effort to change it at the same time. So you're kind of like, are you choosing not to change it to make a point, or are you just not committed to making the change?
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and I kind of feel like it's the second one with these. As much as I do quite enjoy the Scream franchise, I'm hoping that the fifth one's going to do better.
Yeah, the one that's due out this year, next year?
Next year, 2022, yes.
Yeah, hopefully, because again, they've set up, I suppose, this like legacy of pointing out the problems that are inherent in slasher film and kind of not horror in general, but definitely the slasher genre. So yeah, you would hope that at the end of it all, they will not break from it. They will still obviously have a certain format to them because it's still within the slasher genre, but hopefully they'll incorporate a little bit more diversity. So
fingers crossed. So would you recommend Scream to perhaps people who want to explore further into more feminist leading horror?
I think it might be a good starting point for younger viewers. Maybe not so much kind of more established horror nerds like ourselves, because again, we can see the flaws within the kind of thing. But I think it was a good starting point for me as a younger viewer. When I did see it initially, I recognized that they did present like kind of, I suppose, slightly more stronger female characters than we would have been used to. And even with other films of the time, let's say with I Know What You Did Last Summer or Urban Legend or any of them, even though they kind of went with this new kind of post-slasher format, I feel Scream is still kind of breaks those molds a little bit more. So maybe not for the scholar, but for a younger horror audience, I think it definitely is. It's a starting point. I
Mhm.
would also recommend everybody watching Nightmare on Elm Street as a starting point. I feel the character of Nancy was a huge influence on the later kind of tropes as well, and I feel there's a lot of aspects of her character that play into the character of
Mhm.
Sydney as well. And as I mentioned before, with characters in Stranger Things, like it's a huge influence there in the character of Nancy also in Stranger Things. So yeah, I think it's a starting point. It's not the
Mhm.
best representation, but I think it is a starting point, and it's a fun horror film.
Yes,
Yeah,
absolutely.
even with its problems.
So let's move on to my pick, which is very like, it's quite similar in a way that it has its problems as well,
Yeah.
which obviously we will talk about. But I chose 2009's Jennifer's Body, which is kind of an American horror comedy written by Diablo Cody and directed by Karyn. Hang on, I can't read my own writing. Karyn
Kusama.
Kusama, that's it. It stars Megan Fox and Amanda Seyfried, and it involves two best friends. We've got Needy, played by Amanda Seyfried, and we've got Jennifer, played by Megan Fox. Megan Fox's character, Jennifer, she is kind of mistakenly sacrificed as a virgin by some rock group who want to be really famous. But turns out she's not a virgin. And this satanic ritual turns her into a succubus demon. And she starts going through changes. And she starts eating boys. And Needy has to try and stop her. So what do you think of Jennifer's Body? Are you a fan?
Yeah, I'd never actually seen it before. I watched it this week for the show, but I had been meaning to.
Yeah.
It was on my radar for a long time, and I had been meaning to watch it because I love a good comedy horror.
Yeah.
But no, I really enjoyed it. As you say, like there's mixed moments and some issues, but overall it was a very enjoyable film.
Yeah.
kind of a strange one. I do like Diablo Cody, and I didn't realize she wrote this one as well. So there is that kind of, I don't know, not a weird format, but there's just like certain, it's like Juno, you know, there's like certain language aspects to it, or certain like structural aspects to it that come with her style of writing.
Yeah.
That kind of don't usually fit in with the mainstream, especially with like a mainstream, like teenage centered film. But overall, I found it very enjoyable.
Yeah, I saw Jennifer's Body when it first came out, and I was still kind of in my internalized misogyny phase. So I was like, ugh, Megan Fox. I hate Megan Fox. But then obviously now I'm grown up and, you know, I have checked myself and realized that Megan Fox was a victim of, you know, how the media portrayed her, how her interactions with certain male directors kind of affected her. And looking back, I fucking love Jennifer's Body. Like on a, you know, like a real kind of just as a good fun horror.
Yeah.
And she plays this character so well. You know, she is meant to be a bit of a sex pot, but she's just so much more horrific than that.
Yeah.
And I just think it's great. And I think it was really badly received when it first
apparently
was released.
So. Yeah.
Yes. But now it is getting a bit of a cult following again and having a bit of a second wind, which is always really nice.
Yeah.
So what did you think of the relationship between Needy and Jennifer?
Interesting. I think that's the best word. Because even from the beginning, they have a kind of not supernatural, but there's like they're obviously like best friends from kids or whatever, but you have both a slightly supernatural witchy element to, especially with Needy's character, and then you also have this like queer connotations with their relationship as well. It was interesting, you know. I think it was kind of, not upsetting is the wrong word, disappointing slightly that their relationship was affected so negatively from the get-go. With after like Jennifer's change. I feel like that could have been a little bit more of a build up, as opposed to Needy kind of immediately being what is the word, not rejecting, I suppose, of Jennifer as a friend. Like, I suppose she saw a very monstrous side to her at the very beginning, and obviously that's going to scare the crap out of you. But I feel like if it had been more of a build up, I think it would have kept their relationship a little bit stronger towards the end, and that sort of ending would have been a little bit more impactful, I suppose. But no, it's interesting.
I agree with you. I like the way that, you know, from the outsiders, everyone was like, why are you friends with her? She uses you, blah, 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 blah. But it's like, female or femme relationships at that age are so intense. Like, they're more intense than probably a romantic relationship is. And they kind of do border on romance. You know, like, I'd be interested to see if there was any girl or femme presenting person that didn't have intense feelings for their best friend. Intense and probably confusing feelings as well. Like, I know I did. And that's why I was the biggest gay in the village. But growing up in like small village Ireland.
I was going to say, when it's small village, you're usually the only anyway gay in the village.
It was so funny. Just side note, I remember my husband being like, oh, you know, when you were growing up and in our age, when we were younger, kind of being gay or queer was still very hush hush, and you were still probably violently bullied for it if, you know, they even suspected a little bit of gay in you. And my husband was always like, do you ever wonder like who was actually gay? And I was like, oh, it was me. And he was like, no, but do you ever wonder like who was like the only gay in your class? I was like, it was me. So I really related to Needy in that way, that like you do have these such intense feelings for your best friends, that it is, you know, it's at a time when you're exploring your sexuality and it is like super intense. And I like the way that it portrayed that. And it wasn't just like, oh, she's been my best friend since like school and we shared Barbies and blah, 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 blah. It was like, no, this is what relationships like this are actually about.
I think their friendship, like, it is, I love the expression sandbox love. You know, when she used at the beginning, she was like, no, that's like, you know, it's what friendship is. But as you're saying about the intense feelings, I feel like might be segueing from the film, but like, as you know, a young girl or like a teenage girl, those intense feelings that you feel, it's what you're looking for in a relationship. You know, so it's very hard, especially at the age of like 16, 17, 18, or even in your 20s, depending on what sort of people you're attracted to. I feel like those feelings that you feel when you're like at that height of sexual exploration, as you say, and development, it's what you feel is real. It's like, this is what love is, even if it's not romantic. This is what love should be, and this is what you're kind of searching for and everything else. And I think it is a good play between Needy and her boyfriend, who seem more like friends. You know, like, it's
I hate her boyfriend with a passion.
Like, he's like the ducky, you know, of like, he's that sort of character. He's like the, oh, you're my best friend, and therefore we should be, to quote the song, we should be lovers. Whereas she's kind of like, oh, he's, you know, they just have a weird nerdy friend dynamic and not a boyfriend girlfriend dynamic at all. Whereas Jennifer and Needy have the kind of intense love that you would expect to see in a teenage romance. So yeah, it was kind of an interesting play. Not a fan of Chip.
I just think he's like that circa early 2000s dickhead who like wore his hair that way, listened to All American Rejects, and like thought they were fucking cool, and were just like this complete wet wipe and gaslit Needy at any, you know, available option. And it was just like, oh, go back to writing songs in your basement, like fuck off. I did not like him. And I think because I knew guys like him back in the day, that I was just like, ugh, go away. So let's chat about Jennifer's character and her transformation. I kind of liked the way that, you know, she wasn't a virgin, and that backfired on people that tried to use her, and it turned her. See, I have two minds about it. I'm like, yes, I'm really glad that she kind of took back the power and started eating guys, because I wish I could do the same. But at the same time, I'm like, did she have to be the monstrous woman again? Like, we all see this like trope of the scorned woman who then becomes a monster from it, which I guess happens, but I'm not really sure where to go from there, if you know what I mean. Like,
yeah, I was thinking about this as well, like with the whole kind of monstrous feminine trope as well. I find she, yeah, as you said, like usually it's like a side effect of how the woman is treated, but this wasn't. This was done to her.
Yeah.
But it kind of empowered her as a woman at the same time. It empowered her before you realized the extent of it, I suppose. You know, so I felt like from a feminist point of view, I really like that the monstrous side of her character did empower her as a woman, not just as a feminine monster, you know, that sort of way. But then I think she kind of played into those tropes as well by preying on men. Like it wasn't just, let's say, if a guy came up and was inappropriate with her and then she kind of got her vengeance, she was preying on guys as well, which I suppose in a way as a feminine monster is also empowering, that she was choosing who she, I suppose, consumed. I don't know, that's kind of a gross word. You know, it's again like the tropes you were saying in Scream, it could be flipped both ways, you know. It is empowering but also plays into the trope, so you're I don't know.
I just have such a moral thing. I'm like, fuck yeah, like, yeah, she's going out and like eating guys, like, woo. But at the same time, I'm like, but that just means that like there's this thing of like, if someone goes through trauma and it turns them into a monster, and that's not necessarily the case, you know. We shouldn't, you know, stay clear of people who have gone through trauma because that's made them the monsters they are today. And it's not true. It's a stereotype that's like, you know, we hear it even in a subtle way, as in they're damaged or they're damaged goods, or, you know, this kind of the way. But that's not true. That's just a really bad stereotype that we hear about, that people have gone through trauma now become. You know.
I think it was more not interesting, but like she seemed like this, I suppose, empowered monster up until the point that you find out what happens to her. You know, I think before that you think, okay, something went wrong. You kind of got the indication that these guys were trying to do like some sort of occult ritual, and you kind of think, okay, it went wrong. But you didn't realize how like it affected her. And I suppose it's only after that point that you're like, oh, then as you say, it's because of the trauma that she became this figure. I think up until that point you can kind of go, go you know, Jennifer, you can get your own back. But then when you realize actually what was done to her, you're like, oh, this is depressing again.
We're back to being depressed. So let's touch on the male character. We've already touched on one that I'm like, bleh, bleh. So let's chat about the males in this film and their kind of role in it, I guess.
I suppose they don't have much of a role other than being victims, I suppose, in a very simplified way. I'm trying to think if anybody stands out. I think the guys in the band stand out.
I mean, they're the real villains of the piece.
They
really,
are, you know, and they do get their comeuppance. I feel like there was no particular male character that like stuck with me other than them getting torn apart by Jennifer in a way, you know. Kind of felt sorry for Colin. I was like, oh, the wee goth kid.
He always plays goth kids, doesn't he?
Yeah, he really does. And then I was looking him up on IMDb, and he is in like some sort of like Western or post-apocalyptic Western thing that I don't even know the name of, but he looks really weird. He's like has long hair and a mustache, and it's weird. It's like, no, you are the weird little goth kid.
Goth kid. Yeah. Like even in Criminal Minds, he plays a weird goth kid. Yeah.
And I think he was in something else. I think he might have been in like...
He was in the new Nightmare on Elm Street as the weird goth kid.
There you go.
And he was in something. What have I just watched? There was something else I just watched, and I was like, hey, it's him.
Yeah, kind of felt sorry for him. The rest of them, I was like, meh.
Yeah. What was I about the band? Yeah, the way I feel is like we've got men who are victims, and then we've got the band who are the instigators of everything. It is the men who are after power, who are after fame, who are, fame hungry, and they shit all over a girl and they completely take advantage of a girl to get that power. And it's kind of like an allegory for, what we see a lot of white, straight, rich men doing, which is shitting all over vulnerable people, vulnerable members of society, to get power. So I appreciate that kind of metaphor. But again, I think as well as with Scream, it does suffer from a lack of diversity.
Yes, that also.
Yeah. Even when we think about different bodies, they're both very slim white females. We do get a hint of, bisexuality from Jennifer, where she's like, I go both ways, and you're like, ha ha ha. But other than that, there's nothing else other than straightness in this film.
Yeah, and even like the moment where Jennifer is like in her bedroom and they have that like moment.
Yeah,
it seems to be played for male gaze as opposed to LGBT representation. Which again, I suppose you get with Megan Fox, not trope, but with an actress like that playing a character that she does, I feel like it's that playing into it as opposed to not a connection between the two. It's hard to explain. Yeah, I feel it's more like, ooh, bisexual girls are sexy, as opposed to this is representation of something real.
Yes, like we've got this trope of like bisexual women being fetishized, and it kind of plays into that a lot, and that that leads to a lot of biphobia. It leads to a lot of like violence towards bisexual women and femmes in particular. And I just wish they hadn't gone so male gazy with it, as you said.
Yeah, and I feel like the end scene, again, spoilers, at the end where you find out why Needy is in jail in the first place. Yeah. That scene as well was very sexualized.
Yeah.
And it was interesting to watch, but I also came out of it thinking, I'm not sure why they did that.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, it was kind of, I think it plays into the character of Needy more though, more so. Yeah, she was an odd one.
Yeah, I don't feel like, I mean, when we think about feminist horror, we want especially like non-male characters to be kind of complete characters, to be fully thought out and fully person, like a full person, rather than just this 2D element. And I felt that Needy was very 2D, very.
I felt she had, I think it wasn't even that she was 2D. She wasn't fleshed out, I suppose. It's two-dimensional. But I feel like there was elements there that, like, not that everything has to be explained in a film, but there was like slight, like I was saying, sort of witchy elements to her character, like her having the vision of the ghost, like during her sex scene, or like having that kind of sixth sense when it came to Jennifer.
Yeah.
And even overcoming, like, I suppose, the demon in Jennifer and then her own incarceration. There was elements to it that just didn't really add up.
Yeah.
And you're like, okay, it makes for a slightly more mysterious character, but at the same time, again, from a feminist point of view, you're like, why?
Yeah.
I'm like, was that supposed to make her a slightly more powerful feminine character? Was it supposed to give her a greater connection to Jennifer? Is it I was just kind of a little bit confused. Maybe definitely. It just needs a rewatch, but at the same time I'm like, I'm still a little bit confused.
Yeah. I always kind of compare it to my best friend's Exorcism, which is a book by Grady Hendrix. And have you ever seen it? Have you ever read it? Sorry. So it is basically the same thing. There's these two girls. They're very, very, very attached at the hip. They've got an intense best friendship, like relationship. They are so close, almost like Sixth Sense close. And one of them gets possessed. And it's kind of the same thing. Something happens that the other one doesn't really know what happened, but now her best friend is possessed, and it goes through the states of, and she kind of has quite a similar deterioration like Jennifer does. You know, she goes through personality changes. She starts like hanging out with boys and just not being herself. But it has this well thought out, well fleshed out characters where the best friend sticks with her and is like, you're my best friend in the whole entire world, and I don't want to leave you. I want to get you through this. And I feel like that is a better representation of female friendship.
Yeah, I think that's, like I mentioned before, I think that's what was lacking, because the moment that the kind of monster side of Jennifer showed up, Needy took a step back.
Yeah.
And it kind of, there was moments, you know, like in the classroom and that, where you kind of, she was like, oh, I have my best friend back. But it just wasn't the same. And I feel like at the beginning, when you're trying to represent a friendship, like a female friendship that's so rooted in like childhood and in history, it started to kind of crumble very quickly.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think maybe that was just, I suppose, lacking in terms of, I don't know if it was writing or character development, or that was a choice. I don't think it was a choice. I think it's just lacking in some way. But yeah, my best friend's exorcism sounds what I would have liked to see in Jennifer's body, about like Needy maybe sticking with her to a point of, okay, the demon has kind of overcome Jennifer, and I suppose when she kills her boyfriend, she's like, okay, you're no longer my best friend, and then the final showdown, I suppose, happens. I felt that was kind of lacking, because it's very seldom that you get a film, especially in horror, that is about female friendship, and for them to kind of, for that aspect of it to drop off so quickly, I was just disappointed. A little bit disappointed.
So would you recommend Jennifer's Body to someone looking for feminist horror?
I think so. Yeah, it's a fun film to watch. I think it's very, even though, I don't know, it's hard to know, because I was thinking about this as well. I think it's more of a, I hate the term, but like a more woman's film. I think it would appeal to a female audience more than to a male audience, but then you have aspects of it, especially with like Megan Fox's character, that are very male gazy. So again, I'm like, is that supposed to be a more lesbian gaze, or is it supposed to be a feminist? I don't know, it's hard to know. I know I've said that a lot today. I think it's definitely not something that you shouldn't watch, and I definitely think it's a very fun film. And again, the more you know about Megan Fox as an actor and kind of the whole industry as well, I think it's a more empowering representation of the monstrous feminine than we have seen previously.
Absolutely. So, and out of the two films, which one would you pick over the other?
I don't know. I think maybe Jennifer's Body. I think it's more, again, like Scream has become a little bit dated in a way. Like, it's a very enjoyable film. And again, I think we needed Sidney Prescott moving forward. But as you said, the film itself is lacking in and I think that's more of a, you've mentioned this in other episodes, I don't like to say, but it was of the time, because they highlight the problems of the time within it. But I think in itself, it is slightly dated. But again, for younger audiences, I think Scream is a good starting point. But for anybody who's looking for a fun, slightly gory, but in a fun way, a feminist film, I think Jennifer's Body might be the better choice.
I'm going to have to agree with you there, even though I do believe that Scream is one of those films that has to be included in your horror history. Like, it's just one of those films like The Exorcist, like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, that you have to include. But I definitely think that perhaps Jennifer's Body as an interesting discourse on feminist horror, if you want to go more scholarly, I can't say that word, about it, if you want to, you know, actually look into it, look into the discourse, look into the theory behind it, I think Jennifer's Body is the way to go.
I think so.
Definitely.
Yeah, it's an interesting one.
So before we go, I always ask, what is your favorite horror film?
Again, I think it goes back to the spooky aesthetics, and even though there are problems with the filmmaker, Sleepy Hollow is always going to be my number one go-to. Again, like I was saying, I'm very niche in what I enjoy, and Sleepy Hollow is always something that I enjoy. So I think it's probably my favorite. Like I know you're not a fan, but like The Witch is probably top 5 of my all-time favorite horror films. But it's not something that I can just throw on and watch. I have to be in a certain mood. Or like films like The Haunting, again, are my go-to. I really enjoy them, but the one that always starts off my Halloween season is Sleepy Hollow.
Nice. And also, I just wanted to ask you as well, what do you think is the future of feminist horror, or what do you think should be the future of feminist horror?
I think I was reading a piece on a female horror fans, like fandom, and then how that leads on to a female horror filmmaking. And I think it comes down to who's behind the camera and who's behind the thing. So I think more women have to be involved in making horror for us to be able to see the feminist horror that we want to see on screen. I don't know what that will look like, to be honest, because there's like horror is such a wide-ranging genre, and obviously, like in the past, we've had snippets of what we'd like with Jennifer's Body, things like The Witch, things that like Revenge, Honest Low is one, which was something I was going to suggest, but I was like, might not be a fun watch. So I think we're getting snippets of what we would like to see, but I think it's really down to female or a more feminine influence in the filmmaking, which will show what we want on screen. Again, what that looks like in the future, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I definitely think that, kind of like you said, we need more diversity behind the camera as well, more, not just female, but also trans, non-binary, people of color, Black, Indigenous, Asian screenwriters, makeup artists, like directors, film writers, all of that. It just needs to have different voices and different viewpoints for films to be more inclusive. And we need to start seeing that when it comes down to, like, film festivals having it included. We need to see more, disabled filmmakers making films that include disabled actors and, actual disabled actors, not, people that aren't disabled playing disabled actors. And I just feel like there needs to be so much more inclusion when it comes down to like the festivals and the funding and that kind of thing. And that is what's going to make the space for a diverse range of films.
Very much so.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah, very much so. Because it's not just about feminism or like female representation. It's about all representation.
Yeah.
It's about, as you say, a diversity in all aspects of filmmaking and what you see on screen. So I definitely think it's the only way forward. It's the only way forward.
Yeah.
Again, we're starting to see it, but as you say, it needs to be in every aspect of, like you say, funding, film festivals, how they are advertised as well. Like I think it comes down to everything. It's the only way forward to make it an inclusive space.
That was my chat there with Aoife about feminist horror films. And we discussed 1996's Scream from Wes Craven and 2009 Jennifer's Body, directed by Karyn Kusama. What did you think of our picks? Do you think they are feminist horror movies, or do you think they are not as feminist as everyone makes them out to be? Could we have chosen better films? Let us know on our social media. So that is Instagram, Facebook at What a Scream Podcast, and Twitter at What_Scream. I hope you're all doing okay. I hope you are getting out and seeing the new releases. I have recently seen Candyman, which blew my mind. I absolutely loved it. And I also really enjoyed Malignant. I know a lot of people have a lot of discourse about it, but I really enjoyed it for just a silly horror film. And sometimes you need that. And then we've got Candyman on the opposite end of the spectrum, very enlightening, very poignant for, you know, the points it gets across, and it was fantastic. I mean, not only the screenplay and the direction and the acting, but also the special effects was just amazing. Blew my mind. Fantastic. Best film I've seen probably this year. So yes, that is it. As ever, I hope you are staying horrific, and goodbye.